So I did come to talk to you today about Taylor's Checkerspot and some of the work that we're doing with habitat restoration and reintroduction of the species. And I kind of subtitled this Advancing in the Face of Adversity, and I think it's kind of a dual speak to the prison program and the work that's being done there, but also the hope that comes out of that and out of this restoration and recovery work for a better future, I think, really for all of us, if we can pull these things off and do it together. The species, the Taylor's Checkerspot and its habitat is very highly fragmented and degraded. The future for the species is very uncertain in many respects, and yet I think that we really owe it to ourselves and to these animals to try to put the pieces back together again for the future that we can share together. Taylor's Checkerspot was once one of the most common butterflies found in the Puget lowland prairies, and it flies at the very peak of the spring bloom time there in very high densities, or it did at one time. And in some locations that can still happen. Historically, it's known from at least 24 sites in the South Sound area, but it has been lost due to agriculture, forest succession, development, and invasion by things like Scotch broom, sod-forming grasses, and exotic forbs. Since 1993, there we go. Since 1993, we've lost about, by 1993, we lost about half of those sites. And since then, due to climatic perturbations, isolation, wildfire and fire suppression, small population size, and competing management objectives, we're left with a single sole remaining population in South Sound. And this, and an area that remains the stronghold for West Side grasslands in the Georgia Basin, Puget Trough, Willamette Valley ecoregion, and you can kind of see that area that I'm talking about in the map on the left there. So these South Sound prairies really are spectacular. Due to population loss and threats to its remaining habitat, the species was listed as federally endangered under the Endangered Species Act on October 3rd of this year. And while the declines have occurred range-wide, the area I'm going to focus my talk on today really is in the Puget lowlands. Less than 3% of the original grasslands remain. Much of that is degraded. A very small portion of that really has a high native component to it. We're using kind of a two-pronged approach. Habitat restoration, by strategically adding resources that the butterfly uses for food and for shelter, and then also trying to increase the numbers of the butterflies as well as the numbers of populations itself through this captive propagation, where we can really increase survival over what it would experience in the wild, and then reintroducing those butterflies to these restored sites. We have a huge number of cooperators working on this task, and we have to ask, why are so many people interested in recovering this butterfly? Part of the answer is natural defense, and that seems like kind of an odd juxtaposition, but as you can see, the training lands on Joint Base Lewis McChord are some of our finest prairies that we have remaining. And in fact, 90% of the remaining prairie and oak woodland habitat in South Sound is on the base. They house many of our populations of rare species. They can't train if those species are in this much trouble. So we owe it to them to help them out, to spread that risk, and that conservation burden. Obviously, there's other reasons as well for us to recover these species. I think part of the answer is really what these open spaces mean, I think, to the people of Western Washington. These open spaces are why we're here in the first place. People came west, they came through a lot of dense, heavy forests, they came to these open landscapes, they offered great strategic military locations for training, great areas for farming, for development. So we actually have a deep root in these prairies for our own cultural needs. Not to mention all the other kinds of things that we appreciate and enjoy about them now. In South Sound, we can kind of simply split the landscape we're working with into kind of on joint-based Lewis McCord as well as off joint-based Lewis McCord. And that's kind of an artificial marker, but we often talk about the sites in that sort of a manner. Overall, there's a total of 13 sites that we're restoring in South Sound for this butterfly. We are trying to move beyond kind of a simple habitat restoration to very much an enhancement focus. We have a lot less land than we once had for the butterfly, and so we have to make a lot more of it. We also don't really know what these prairies looked like historically. One of the pictures that I showed you earlier is the closest we have, but it is still a broken prairie. And so we're kind of making some of this up as we go along with the butterfly and other key species in mind. To that end, we're planting dense concentrations of the larval and adult plant resources, creating dense patches of those that are multi-species assemblages of both larval hosts as well as nectar plants. We are trying to create this very open and low vegetation condition so that the adults can get to the ground to bask and to oviposit, and so that the larvae can warm up on our cold days, because they come out in January, believe it or not, to start feeding. They really need that heat close to the ground. And we're trying to do this across a whole variety of environmental gradients so that we have kind of a portfolio effect, both in terms of moisture but also in terms of temperature. We don't know what climate change will bring. We do know that we have a tremendous amount of year-to-year variability right now that we're already trying to deal with. All of the sites we're working with right now, by and large, are on the warm, dry side of the whole spectrum. And that's kind of a dangerous place to be. So we're really trying to expand that out. To date, we have put in, actually this is, I think, as of 2012, 358,000 plugs, plant plugs have gone into the ground, and 174 kilograms of native seed. Yeah.
These various species?
Yes, it is there's about 50 species of plants that we're putting in, not just for Taylor's Checkerspot. We kind of create this whole prairie matrix and then these patches of dense resources for the butterflies within that. So while we're kind of targeting a single species management approach, you can't fill it all with just the plants that Taylor's Checkerspot needs. There's a whole long growing season outside of that. So. And our strategy is to actually overseed a lot of these planted areas with native seed of other species, or sometimes the same. Sometimes we'll plant Castanea plugs and then overseed with Castanea seed as well. Or we might mix Plantago in there as well, because it's an excellent host species for the butterfly.
Is Plantago, I see a lot of the ribbed plantain used both
pre-diapause and
post-diapause.
Yes. And that is one of the really interesting things, is that it's the only plant we know for sure seems to be available and green throughout both of the time periods of the larvae that are feeding. So we have some concerns about whether Castanea can really do that or not, but we're still learning a lot about Castanea and what it has the potential to do, because so many of the sites are so degraded that there's literally a handful of plants. It's not a healthy population of Castanea, and so we're continuing.
Since I brought that up, the pre-diapause and post-diapause, do you want to explain that to the audience who might not understand what I was talking about?
Sure, and I apologize because I should have said that on the first slide. I actually had kind of a bit of the life cycle on that first slide. So the eggs are laid in typically about mid to late May. They hatch and the larvae develop through their first several instars. We found that they go to about 5th instar and go into diapause. I know John's eyes just went wide, but that is what we are seeing. They go into diapause by mid-July, and that's when the prairies dry up. There's no more rain, there are well-drained soils, everything's fried by then. They go to sleep until January, and that's when things actually, believe it or not, start to warm up and green up again in these west side prairies. And so they feed through the 5th and 6th instars and then pupate typically in late March and emerge again as adults about mid-April or mid-May, depending on the year. They really move their season around a bit, and I can show you what that looks like a little later. So in essence, we're trying to take these very degraded prairies like you see on the left-hand side and turn them into something much more functionally useful and beautiful, as you see on the right. And another question back there.
How do you get rid of the plants you don't want in this type of setting?
We have a number of strategies. We do use quite a bit of herbicide, I'm sorry to say, but we really have realized it is the only way. It is not the only way, but it is a key tool. We actually also employ kind of what we call a scorched earth policy, where we burn it, and then in the fall, we then follow it up with essentially a treatment of Roundup, because the exotics tend to come up first within a couple weeks, ideally, if you're lucky. So we just kill all those, as many as we can, right off the bat, and then we shift to 2 additional sprayings of a grass-specific herbicide, because by then your native plants are starting to come up and we don't want to damage those, and so we're really just targeting the grasses. If that all goes really well, and usually there's a few more years of treatment ahead of that whole scene, but if that really goes well, then you're in a good position to seed and plug, as you were seeing in that.
So
that
the seeding and plugging comes after this regime?
After all that, yeah, and it's really critical to get rid of as much of the exotics as possible before you get into that. Otherwise, it's just a battle and you lose your resources. The survival, especially of the plugs, is not that high after a couple of years. They do well the first year, and then you just start to lose them. And the more competition there are with other exotic species, the harder it is to make that happen.
Do you ever kill your weeds with light barriers like plywood, cardboard, or anything that would block the light?
Not at the scale we're trying to do things. There was some restoration research that Eric Delvin did that looked at using a technique like that, and he found it he had, I think, 4 different sites he was working on, and the success of that strategy varied quite a bit from site to site. So it is a technique that can work under the right conditions. I know it's used in California, actually, for the bay checkerspot. They do quite a bit of that. At the scale and with the way that we've been working, we haven't really employed it.
This to this, I would guess for 90% of everybody I know. Well, what's wrong? I mean, they're both green. They're natural.
I know, and to be honest, these aren't the best examples. This wasn't my slide, but I'll point some things out. So this right here is a nice patch of Plectridis congesta. That is a native annual that is used actually both as a nectar plant and a post-diapause larval host plant. They eat it as a seedling plant right when it comes up or it actually germinates in the fall, and they eat it in January, February. You've got a whole bunch of Castanea hispida right in here. Very rare plant on our prairies, far more rare than many. I think it's actually, in some respects, more endangered than the Castanea levisecta, the golden paintbrush, which is actually a federally threatened species. So, yes, they're both green, but green's actually not what we're after. And some of the other pictures, you'll actually see, or you can see here, see the bare patches here in the ground, so you've got more structure. Here things are pretty uniform, pretty dense. So this is even in, like, this is probably after quite a few treatments already.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't
The Scotch
challenging.
broom's gone, the oak grass is gone.
I wasn't challenging what you're
Yeah,
doing,
yeah.
but it just seems to me that to convey this to very many people
Yes.
is a real challenge.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. So one of the other things that we've done is reach out to the Sustainability in Prisons Project for a helping hand. Because of the scale that we are trying to do this work at, they have turned out to be an excellent partner. And really, the Sustainability in Prisons Project really is this whole group of partners as well. They have been involved in raising these rare prairie plants. There's 2 different greenhouse facilities, one at the Washington Correction Center for women, that's in Purdy, and the Stafford Creek Correction Center as well, out near the coast. The 3rd site, Shotwell's Landing, is actually owned by the Center for Natural Lands Management, and that's in Thurston County. So between those 3 facilities, nearly 1 million plants have been produced since 2009. A target capacity of 400,000 plant plugs per year, 50 species annually. It's a huge task. And this is really just a small number of the plants overall that we're dealing with, because most of our work is actually going into seed production. And you can see an example of that here in the corner. We're row cropping these native prairie plants, harvesting the seed so that we can really do this on the scale of, hundreds of acres, thousands of acres, which is the job that we need to do.
Are you being careful about what gene stock you're using of these plants?
Yeah, we have a tremendous amount of effort going into not only the development of the protocols to rear all these plants, but retaining all the information of where the genetic stock came from, how long it's been in captivity, when do we go back and get new stock, where did it come from? Sometimes it's from several different populations. So yeah, there's a huge amount of tracking that happens on all these plants. So to talk a little bit more then about the second component of the project, the increasing animal numbers, we started captive rearing in 2003, well, 2003 sort of. 2003, a female voucher specimen came in to Clallam County and laid eggs on a Cassowary host plant, and that was sort of the birth of the captive rearing program. We transferred that program to the Oregon Zoo in 2004, and they have done a tremendous job of developing the methods for really rearing this butterfly up, to the thousands of animals that we need today. All the animals are coming from this single source location at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and this has often been described as the most violent place on Joint Base. It is part of a 7,000-acre prairie that's a heavy arms, live fire artillery impact area. It's where the military does its training with 50 caliber shells. They lob them up and blast them into the center. That training actually causes fires. That's part of what keeps this prairie in the shape that it's in. That and the fact that it's restricted from a lot of other human access. So it's an amazing site, but not exactly a safe place for butterflies. So we're trying to move some of those butterflies off of that site to these other sites where we can manage for them more easily and in a safer setting. The Mission Creek Correction Center for women, we opened a captive rearing facility there a couple of years ago, as Heidi mentioned. They have done a phenomenal job. This program operates as kind of a satellite with the Oregon Zoo as an oversight facility. They have, in their first year, they were able to match all the same survival rates that we were getting at the zoo, as well as contribute some new techniques to the program. It has just really been a success. The women that have worked at it did all the setup of the lab. They keep meticulous notes. It is the cleanest, most spotless, most well-organized lab I have ever seen anywhere. It really, it's something that's a great pride to me, because, not that I did anything but helped them get it going, but it's just really neat to be a part of it. They've also been involved in doing oviposition preference research on Cassowary levicecta, which is the golden paintbrush that's federally listed. There were various references in the literature to it being a host plant for Taylor's Checkerspot, but there was not really any concrete proof. this was kind of a first step at trying to put some of these pieces together. And in fact, what they found was that the Castanea levisecta and the Castanea hispida were equally preferred over Plantago for oviposition by the females. So really neat opportunity for these gals to be involved in this work, doing real science, learning a ton in prison. We developed a certification program for them, and there's a whole list of criteria and hours that they have to put in before they get these certificates. They're actually recognized by Evergreen State College. They can basically get them as credits.
I want one.
I'm sure you deserve one, John. So
You
this is
wanna
just a
do
really
time
neat
at
program.
Lynch Prison.
I was mentioning survival. These butterflies in the wild, 1 to 5% survival, basically, from egg to adult. We are averaging between 45 and 65% survival, egg to adult, as a result of this program. This is hard to sort of figure out what all this says, but basically these life stage survivals, you can see that we're up, in the 90 percentile, stage by stage, for these butterflies that we're rearing. We can't get much higher. It can get much higher and it gets scary. There's too many of them. Not enough room. In 2006, we started systematically monitoring the population at range 76, both to be able to sort of justify the take for the captive room program, but also to get some kind of baseline data on the population fluctuations that might be occurring at a natural site. And we've continued to do that over time. And as you can see, the abundance estimates on the left-hand side there are on a log scale. So these population fluctuations, and I don't have 2013 data in here yet, we're changing roughly an order of magnitude every year or two. That is our background starting condition against which we are trying to recover this species. You'll also notice that the flight season, both the length as well as the phenology of it, is shifting from year to year, back and forth across that chart. So I keep talking about this butterfly as the most it varies in every single way possible. It is completely plastic as far as I'm concerned.
The Checkerspots, they all do that.
Yeah, and it is really difficult because people want rules. They want, give me the recipe for how to raise them or how to do this or how to do that. And it's like, I love all the head shaking I'm seeing here because that is not an easy sell. Yeah.
How do you do your counts? I mean, how do you determine if it's 10,000?
Right. So these data are all based on distance sampling, which is essentially walking a transect down the prairie. We count every butterfly that we see and we estimate the distance from the line we're walking. We typically truncate that data after the fact at about 10 meters because that's how far you can reliably see. You see a lot fewer out further than that. But then we can take that density estimate and we can actually calculate an average density across the whole prairie. We know the area that we've surveyed, and that's how we come up with these. Basically, these points each represent a daily population abundance estimate that's based on a count. The actual count may have been somewhere in here, and I didn't put up the information, but this is multiplied out several times from what we actually counted. But that's how we get each of the points on there and then can make a curve like that. We're still working out exactly how best to turn these curves into an actual population estimate for the season because you've got those adults emerging and dying throughout that whole time period every few days. So it's always messy. We're working on it though. So what is it we're trying to do with the reintroduction? Right now what we're trying to do is establish at least 3 new populations at 3 Puget lowland sites in the next decade. We are planning to release at least 1,500 larvae, post-diapause larvae, at a minimum of 2 sites annually, and continue that process at each site, ideally for at least 5 years. after the 5 years, we continue to survey for another 5 years before we really feel good about the population being established. So what does it mean, how do we define success? Success we defined as a minimum of 250 adult butterflies for one of those single-day abundance estimates. That the butterflies are widely distributed across the monitoring area. And here we're using an area of about 50 acres or 20 hectares in size. And that they occupy the site solely through reproduction for at least 5 consecutive years. And so the way that we actually came up with that 250 was to take our worst year ever, 2009, take the high point there, which was actually about 500, and we halved that because range 76, where that data come from, that site is twice the size of the sites that we're restoring. It's a very large site. So that's the whole area that we survey there. And this is what widely distributed looks like. All those black dots, so these are our survey transects that we walk. Each of these is a 50-meter segment. And you can see that butterflies are present literally on every single one of those segments at some level. These are actually, in this case, cumulative numbers, total observations for the season on each of those, but we actually have those as daily density, daily estimates as well. And this is the other piece we really want to see, is we want to see oviposition, we want to see the larvae develop. What's been very exciting is to see that they are using both Castanea and Plantago in the field. The source site at range 76 really only had Plantago until a few years ago when some seeds and Castanea seed was spread there. I'm glad to see that, yeah.
And I thought the Plantago there at 76 was actually kind of a grungy looking, ecotype that hadn't been.
It's all different kinds. It's a huge site with, millions of plants, and they're enormously diverse. Plantago in general is very diverse. If you look at it in January, it looks pretty pathetic. And some years more so than others.
All talking Plantago lanceolata ribbed plantain?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so the reproduction is obviously very important because we don't want to keep dumping these animals in. We want the habitat to be in good shape and they take off on their own. That's ideally what we would like to see. So since about 2009, we've been able to rear these animals in the thousands enough to get good size releases going. Remember, 95% mortality, you got to have a lot to get through this bottleneck. We're pleased to see lots of signs that what we're doing is working. Adults are using the habitat for nectaring, for oviposition. We're seeing clusters of larvae out there, in some cases quite abundantly. We've used the same kind of monitoring strategy, the distance sampling at our reintroduction sites, and found that that works even when densities are quite low. And so we've continued to do that over the years as well. And luckily for us, that high mortality is offset by also a high capacity for survival. In a good year, these guys can really crank out a lot of animals, and that's the kind of thing that we're seeing. Oopsie, that's not the one I wanted. With this site right here. You'll notice the blue ones didn't really take off, but these purple ones did. Not every site's going to do as well as another. We're still working it out. But this site here is a new one that just started last year. That's pretty typical performance in a first year. The survival, we think, is much lower in that first year. Once you get kind of a critical density of butterflies, that sends the message that yes, this habitat's suitable, the animals are more inclined to stick around the zone. But it really does seem to make a difference if you get something established in the first place. At this site, we're certainly seeing, again, good distribution across the site. You can see the boxes here. Those are our release plots that we're using. We typically try to site those in the very best larval habitat that we can find that's well surrounded by good nectar sources. So, and as we've continued, we have also refined our release strategy. We're shooting for that 1,500 per year per site, but we've also realized that we might stop if we're actually hitting at least 500 adults in that single day abundance estimate, and they're widely distributed across the area. So we may stop before that 5-year time period is up. If we drop below that 250 mark, we're going to go ahead and add again, because we don't want to waste what we've already done. But if a thing takes off by itself, great. Yeah, John?
You get new breeding stock each year from the population?
Yes, we do. We try to take in animals from Range 76 every year. We captive rear those. We do hold a few of those to be able to breed, but all the offspring that are bred in captivity go immediately out. We don't keep any of those for a second year. So we try to keep that thing going, and so far it's worked great. 2009, we actually did not bring anyone in because we were so concerned. The population was so low that it was hard to find 2 to 3 butterflies in the same place at the same time. For checker spots, that's not a comfortable place to be peak of the season. Not after what I've seen out there, where you're literally walking through clouds of them. On the other hand, there's a site that we've continued beyond that 5-year mark where we weren't seeing the kind of response that we were hoping for. We're continuing to do restoration on that site, and we're in this process of actually trying to kind of assess or reassess the habitat to ensure that we really do have suitable habitat. We're still struggling with the definition of exactly what suitable habitat is. In a way, we're sort of trying to throw the book at them, but actually getting these prairies to the point we'd like them to be at is a huge challenge. So currently we have 4 occupied sites up from the 1 that we started at. We certainly aren't at a point where we would call these established yet, but they are looking very promising. And we're early in this work, but we've got a fair amount of it under our belts as well, which is it's nice to be in this position at the point of federal listing. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else because in many respects the work will get a lot harder from here. These animals really are so endangered that every one of them counts at this point, and so a big job to do. And just to leave you with this, single species enhancement is kind of what we're doing here, but the beauty of the thing is that really many species are benefiting from the work that we're doing here. And kind of one of my personal favorite things is that there's an area on Joint Base that we're restoring for checker spots, and it was an area that the larks, the streaked-horned larks, which is another a state endangered, federally threatened species, went in and started using all that native prairie for nesting, and that was that. Otherwise they use the side of the runway.
They don't need tailors though, do they?
I have seen them do so once.
What kind of larks?
Streaked-horned lark.
Streaked-horned.
Streaked-horned lark.
Okay.
Yeah, it's our west side subspecies. Yep. That's many thank yous to many people and many funders that have made all of this work possible. And I'm certain that this is not a complete list because it goes on and on, but it's a tremendous effort. A lot of coordination and a lot of goodwill on a lot of people.
You got Jared, huh? Jared Daniels?
Yes.
Right, huh?
Jared, yeah. And I'd be happy to take any questions. And I should actually mention that this is some work that MACOM here at the university did last year. This is actually Castelleo levisecta, and we did a trial release on that with post-diapause library last year, and we loved it. So.
This isn't a question, but I have to say it because you'll appreciate it, I think. I had an epiphany earlier this year with Andy Warren and Paul Severance down at the last remaining Taylor's site in Oregon. Can't remember the name, something Hill or something. And we were up there way before even the larvae. It was like late January. And And then we had this conversation concerning, you know, Plantago lanceolata. Well, this is a non-native plant, okay? And there's still no question that it is widely used by this butterfly in many places, either as a preference or as a necessity. You know, we don't know now because things have disappeared in between. So since that plant has probably been here in the Puget Trough for less than 200 years, what we're looking at is a butterfly that has taken advantage of that plant, adapted to it, and probably expanded its range from whatever it was, you know, in a primitive state. I mean, who knows what it was like 400 years ago? It would have been kind of a neat thing to do. But I'm encouraged by the fact that people are beginning to recognize this, and instead of focusing on simply restoration, they're focusing on preservation, which it has some restorative aspects to it. But as you demonstrated, it's more importantly, it has the functional use of this non-native plant is going to be the secret to that butterfly's success.
Right, right. You know, we are trying to bring back in as many natives as we can, but not before, you know, we're not going to back off on the Plantago until we can really demonstrate that that system can work too. But right now we don't really know how.
Do you see any preferential use of the...
They love to lay on Castellea. Whether there's really a preference for it, you know, in the field, all that work is yet to be done. I mean, certainly the lab results suggest that, and what Mike Singer has seen is that that doesn't change when you transfer that to the field situation.
So you know Singer's working?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, we certainly see a lot of overposition on Castellea. The thing that concerns me a lot about it is especially when we have individual plants, when they're not in with other plants or other host plants, we watch early instar larvae desiccate. The plants dry up, there's nowhere to go, it's history.
Well, that's a little bit of risk in that with checker spots everywhere.
Right, which is fine unless you're in a native species.
Exactly.
That is how checker spots work, but in our system it's not working.
Well, it's kind of, I mean,
trying to bridge that gap.
We hope that they get to like Plantago, even though that's not a native plant.
Right.
It is a plant that is easier to, you know.
They do well on it.
Yeah.
They do very. I mean, our biggest population at range 76 really is dependent basically solely on that plant, and it's doing better than anything. So.
You know that Phaeton, now Euphorbia Phaeton now is being documented as using planting widely in the east.
Mm-hmm.
We just had a paper in the Journal of Livestock, the last journal, documenting that it's made a switch to plantain. It's right alongside the Cholo and Glabra. But they seem to maybe even prefer it, and they seem to be expanding range.
Right, interesting, yeah. I mean, and as you well know, that the reward plantain, English plantain, it's heavily used by checker spots in Europe, where it's native. So, I mean, we talked about variability, and they get it.
Well,
we might have issues with it, but they get it.
If Taylor's is going to survive, it's going to be because of that plant, probably.
Yeah, I don't think we would have them without it.
Yeah. Do you know anything about that fungus that attacks the lanceolata?
No more than you do.
Okay.
So, I am less concerned. It's a constraint, but because it tends to be worst in late January, early February when the larvae are just emerging. And one of my theories has been, are they sort of coming out and basically diaposing themselves to death? They come out, the host plant's in poor condition, they go back to sleep for another year. Maybe they come out, they do that again. Eventually, you just rot in Western Washington if you keep doing that. But one of the strategies that we started early on was to use our native annuals, which germinate in the fall and grow slowly through the winter, and they're not affected by that fungus. So overseeding the Plantago with those native annuals to try to address that issue. So that
Right. Well, I was there in January. I saw all of that, and I was told that only a month later they looked much better. So,
oh yeah, they come through it. As soon as the weather really starts warming up and the growth picks up, the Plantago comes out of it. The other thing too is in January, early February, the larvae are not eating a whole lot.
No.
So it doesn't, you know, my sense is that it doesn't seem to be too much of a pinch point for them. And some years I'm sure it's worse than others, but I haven't noticed like, oh, there was a whole bunch of larvae in January and February. Where'd they all go by end of February or March? You know, I haven't seen that kind of a thing. So, yeah, there was several other hens, yeah.
You mentioned your larvae over winter is 5th instar, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really curious. Do you have any suggestion why that's so different from our mountain populations, which overwinter in second and summer, maybe third?
I'm guessing it's a climatic thing. I mean, certainly the Vances too down in California, diapause is at third instar. So, I mean, they have plenty of growing time to get that big, and it's a good step. Given how early, it's sort of interesting the timing of the different subspecies from, across these really different, habitats. This species just pushes the edge, the environmental edge, every chance it gets. And that's why, I mean, even though it's overwintering as a fifth instar larvae, it's flying by mid-April. You know what it's like in mid-April around here. It is not nice. It is not warm, it is not sunny, it is raining, but they're doing it. And they don't have much more time to pull the other half of the life cycle off.
I think you hit it on the mark that this is a taxon, all over its range, that's undergoing this kind of remarkable thing. It's really dynamic right now. So, I mean, if you did this 100 different places wherever you could, and whatever colonies you find along Juan de Fuca or in the islands, wherever you find colonies, you probably find a lot of variability. I just didn't think that the variability would ultimately get it to the fifth instar before diapause. That is surprising.
Yeah.
You said they have a sixth instar?
Yeah.
Total of 6? Okay.
Yeah, or more if they go back in, and if you can imagine it, I think is what it's like into it. So, because as they're going in and out of diapause, so if they go in a second year, they actually shed that diapause skin. They might start feeding, and then they'll remolt again into that smaller, head capsule and the denser body. That's what they actually diapause in. So,
I can't help thinking there's more to it than just resources. John, we've been up to Quartz Mountain, that huge field where there's many either Checkerspots. They, even on years when there's cast away all over the place at stage straight, well late in the season, the larvae just disappeared. And they're disappearing at probably second instar. You can't find them, they're going below ground or whatever. And the next year, you'll find the second and third instar coming out the following year and starting to feed. So even when they have the resources there, they're not growing to a later instar.
Well, that's at about almost 6,000 feet, so there's other extenuating factors too.
Closer to 7, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'll have to think about what things might be triggering that, because I'm not familiar enough with the timing of some of those other things to know.
You mentioned seeing thousands of these, right? Well, it's good to have. I'm so old that I'm one of the few people that has ever seen them like that in the native way. But people would say, yeah, right, fella. I mean, literally, you could look into the distance and there would be a haze of Venus Checkerspots. So you've seen them where there are just hundreds of them around you at every second.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at this graph, this is 10,000, and that's a daily population estimate that we're hitting. And you can see that in several years we've hit that, repeatedly. So
They have that capacity.
yeah, it's phenomenal. It is a sight to behold, and that's a really fun thing to share back with people about. Like, this is worth protecting. It is worth walking through a cloud of butterflies and experiencing that.
Well, they're pretty
and
cool
keep bloom on the
butterflies.
prairie. It's amazing. Yeah.
You mentioned other species. What are you seeing with the bumblebee population?
There's somebody else that has done some work with bees. I haven't. I mean, there is, one of the things that we see is in these same prairies that we're restoring, we see a lot, and pardon me, I am so ignorant on species identities of many butterflies and moths and everything else, but we see a tremendous amount of invertebrate diversity on these prairies that go right alongside the plant diversity. Because these prairies, even though we're trying to make them diverse for checkerspots, but they are already many of the most diverse prairies we have, that's what you get in a high quality prairie. And the plants like balsam root, they literally have a hover cloud of insects around them like this. Every single one of them is like a world unto itself of invertebrate life. And so there really is, in protecting these places, we really are protecting a lot of other rare species, I think, in the process. And what's unfortunate is we don't even know what we're protecting. We don't even know what these things are called, and there's a tremendous amount more work. Unfortunately, Joint Base is not really interested in having us name all those things. But there's probably many things out there that are maybe far rarer than even the Checkerspots themselves. So, yeah.
Was there any thought to the shelling of these areas where I mean, these are the last places that EDIS existed in Washington, right? I mean, at least in the southern Prairie region.
Yeah.
Any thought to the idea that shelling actually contributed to that? And is there something we learned from artillery?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a blessing and a curse. It provides the fires that keep the system clean. Unfortunately, sometimes those fires are too early and they're burning through and the larvae are still in a pre-diapause state. I think that there's a good chance that they have impacted and do impact mardon skipper populations, because mardons are later in their development, and even if they should happen to survive a fire, there's no food left once the fire moves through. Those fires burn almost every single year, especially through certain portions of that prairie, every single year.
I've seen a picture, a video of somebody standing right in the middle of one of these fires. And he'll say, yeah, I'm in the middle of a prairie burning. And what you see is little grass here and a little plant there. And yet he is actually in sort of open bare ground where there's not much burning. And yet if he pans up, you can look around, he actually is sitting in the middle of a prairie fire. So it's just kind of ongoing.
And the structure, that open structure with bunch grasses, bare ground, and forbs scattered around in between, that's the kind of fire you get when you have a nice open landscape like that. If you have that sod-forming grass, and that thing burns, it's black. It's solid black, and everything dies with it. So, yeah. So yeah, the fire is definitely a good and bad.
Does the base try to control the fire to any extent, or does it just naturally burn?
We keep talking about trying to figure out a plan to do some fire control out there. We can't do active control because there's live shells. You can't go running around putting it out. You can't drive heavy vehicles out there by and large. So we're kind of brainstorming a bunch of different strategies, whether it's vegetation, whether it's laying wet lines, whether it's doing something to try to break the fire up a little bit so we have a little bit more control over it. Because especially when an early fire gets started, and that's how we lost one of the populations out in that area, we had kind of back-to-back fires, both of which burned in like May and June, well before anything should have been burning. And so it's those kind of fires that we would, try to target in certain years to try to get a little bit more control of the situation. So,
Is there a base biologist? I've heard that there is.
yes,
such a person.
yes. Mhm.
And do you work with that person?
Yes, I do. I actually have a joint position with JBLM, and so I work with them on a lot of this. And then a lot of their biologists are mainly focused on the habitat restoration out there, because they have 20,000 acres of good prairie that they're working on. So they mostly focus on that. But yeah, myself and a number of other folks are also working with the animal populations there. So, yeah.
You started with a very small area you could get the original butterflies from. Do you worry about how much variability and genetic diversity is within that? Is that a limiting factor with climate change coming at us?
One of the goals, and I don't have a way of dealing with it yet, but one of the goals ultimately is to capture as much of that genetic diversity as possible and make sure it's transferred to every one of our reintroduction sites. So that's a longer term goal, and there's even a number of surrogate ways we can kind of try to tackle that without knowing exactly what the genetics are. For example, even though we're rearing a lot of these butterflies from a relatively small number of founder stock, but should we decide to boost genetic diversity, what I would do is just go out and collect larvae and just move them and collect them from all over that Range 76 site, move them, and I'm going to have captured way more genetic diversity than I ever will through the captive rearing process. So that's just one of the thoughts that I have. So yeah, we do continue to collect, from across the entire site. It's great we have the numbers we have, but when you dive into a hole like this, I have to think that that, has got to have pretty profound effects on your genetic diversity.
You talk about genetic diversity. I've heard nothing about using anything from like the population I surveyed in the Olympic Peninsula. Is there a reason that you don't, or are you?
Well, a couple things there. This population is the largest anywhere in the range. Most of the populations are considerably smaller than this one. We limit our take to 1 to 2% of the population. So you wouldn't be able to take very many if you decided to do that. There's also a bunch of other hoops that we typically jump through first before we start mixing things like that. And Paul Severance has been doing some work on the genetics of tailors, and that seems to support, at least not now, it's not the time to mix up. We need to maintain separation.
The one thing that is becoming apparent, in fact, is in my sense of things, and my consciousness, it's just this year, the idea that what we're looking at with tailors is it's a non-native butterfly. It's a butterfly that doesn't have native populations anymore. Ever since Plantago came in, so what we're looking at is a phenomenon. I think she described it accurately. It's a really remarkable phenomenon, but it's not something that we can restore because A, we don't know what that was. B, plantain has forever removed that possibility. So these Puget prairies are dynamic in a special kind of way. I don't think it really makes any difference as long as you're dealing just with the prairie. If you transplanted Area 76, I like Area 76, but it's kind of like 51. To any of the other spots, there's a sort of a regulated chaos that sort of characterizes these populations anyway. Just your flight period stuff and the numbers, all that just kind of shows whatever is going to happen, it's going to happen real quick. So there's probably a lot of genetic diversity in any stock that you take out. So I wouldn't worry too much about transplanting those things. I had concerns before. I just called Paul Severance the night before I came, just so I'd be brushed up on a little bit. But now you wouldn't want to mess with those things in Clallam County or anywhere else that we might find. Bringing them down to the prairies, and taking prairie stuff up there, that's definitely a no-no. But as long as you're staying in the prairies, that's the only hope. These things, you got 4 colonies now?
Yeah.
Bravo.
Yeah, but it all came from one, yeah. Luckily that one was big. So, yeah. Yeah, that environmental gradients especially across big elevation changes like that, is definitely a cause for concern.
Is what you're doing funded by the state, or is it funded by a large number of these organizations who are helpers?
It is heavily funded by the Department of Defense. We also receive generous funding from Fish and Wildlife Service. Oregon Zoo actually kicks in some in-kind funds to their own program. The state ultimately gets all of its money from the feds.
Sometimes.
Sometimes, if we're lucky. Otherwise, we have very little.
I was just wondering because of extreme budget conditions, how
Sure.
does anyone convince the legislature
We
they
don't.
can fund something like that?
Yes, we have not been successful in doing that. I think we would not be doing any of this work if we're not for DOD. Really, and I didn't talk about the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program. ACUB is really, the thing here that's made all this possible. That program was designed to buffer the bases because there's so much development and encroachment on the edge of bases nationwide. They developed this program to try to buy up some of that land to prevent development right up to the edge of the base, and also to move some of the conservation burden onto those lands so that they can free up their training lands. We managed to get Congress to rewrite the rules on that program so we could use that money for management, not just land purchase. We've been very successful in this state because of our state, I'm not thinking of the name of the program, I apologize. We have a great state program for being able to buy conservation lands. We've been very successful at doing that in South Sound. We had no money to manage those lands whatsoever, and if you don't manage a prairie, you don't have a prairie. So we've been able to use that military funding to actually manage these lands off the base for the recovery of these species. which
You
is-
started off by saying you managed to get the Congress to vote on something?
Yeah, can you believe it? It was years ago. Yeah, we did. We actually got them to rewrite the rules, because originally it really was a land acquisition program, and we got them to agree to allow us to use this money for management. And now other bases are starting to pick up on that as well. Management funds are very difficult to come by. So. Great. Well, thank you all.